Professor Stiglitz, thank you very much for being with ERT tonight. Many analysts say that the past winter was the easy one and that the tough times are ahead of us, taking into consideration, of course, the soaring prices in energy, in food, etc. What's your take on that? Do you agree?
Putting aside the disturbances in the Middle East that we don't know how they're going to play out, I'm actually more optimistic. There was a lot of fear last winter. We managed through that, and the critical thing was that we became less dependent on oil and gas. Renewables increased. We managed the food crisis, which was partly due to climate change. So the fact that we managed the last winter gives me optimism about the coming winter. And in particular in Europe, one of the things that was very difficult in the months after the invasion of Russia of Ukraine was electricity prices that were very linked to the price of gas. And most of the countries in Europe have figured out how to delink it so that the soaring of those electricity prices hasn't been the problem that it was originally. It was a totally man-made problem. That is to say, there was a wrong regulatory structure, and that led to high electricity prices. It was not necessary. It just made more profits for the electricity companies. So I think we learned a little bit about how to manage the kind of disturbing. So putting aside, I say, the Middle East, which is hard to do, I'm actually optimistic.
And I understand from what you're saying that the less dependency on the Russian oil is also helping out Europe in tackling all those problems, right?
That's right. And learning, it's not only the lack, becoming less dependent on Russian oil, it's the sanctions on Russian oil, which is keeping the price of oil down, but it's also learning how to manage the consequences of oil and the way that oil and gas trickles through to other prices. That we've learned better about how to do that. So when a crisis occurs, you have to learn a little bit how to manage it. We've learned how to manage it, and the war seems to have in Ukraine seems to have stabilized. I mean, I wish it were over, but it looks at this point that it's going to be a perhaps long struggle of the kind that we've seen elsewhere in the region, sort of a frozen conflict. This is a little bit hotter than many of the other frozen conflicts, but just goes on and on and on.
Now, just because you made a reference on that, do you sense the current situation in the Middle East? Of course, we don't know how it will evolve, but it's causing problems that maybe it's impossible for us to foresee now. What's your take, and how do you see it deploying?
Well, one of the things you have to think back in history and realize that the oil price crisis of the 1970s was caused by a Middle East conflict.
Right.
And this conflict is a very intense one, and very different from earlier conflicts.
In what ways?
Well, those involved the countries in the Middle East fighting the state of Israel. This is all the power of Israel fighting 2.3 million defenseless people living in this little enclave and creating a humanitarian crisis, which, the people in the Middle East, hard for not to anticipate that they would respond very strongly, and may not be a question of going to war, but it may be a question of taking actions which they feel will penalize those associated with causing this massacre, and that might mean, as what happened in the 70s, raising the price of oil. You know, turning the one power that Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq have is they control a large part of the global supply of oil. And if they turn down the spigot, we could have another spike in the price of oil.
Right.
And that could be a serious problem, as it was in the 70s.
And would that affect the U.S. also? Because the U.S. has a lot of its own reserves and other countries that it gets oil from.
Yeah, the United States is a little bit protected, but we are, at this juncture, close to energy independent. It would be interesting, though, because we've signed all kinds of international trade agreements which forbid us from putting barriers to the export of oil. And now, what does that mean? That means the price of oil in the United States is linked to the global price. And that, in turn, would mean that the oil companies in America would do fantastic. So the country as a whole would be protected, but it would be a huge transfer from ordinary citizens to the oil companies. Now, when that happened earlier, many of us said we ought to have a windfall profits taxes, that this was you might say, an unjust enrichment to Exxon and the other oil companies. But the U.S. government refused to do that. And so it was one of the factors increasing inequality. This time, I'd say, things could be different. I mean,
but Europe is in a much worse position than the U.S., right?
Europe is in a much worse position because with the exception of, say, Norway, which is an energy exporter, most of Europe is an energy importer. And global price of energy goes up, Europe has to pay out more. And not all the countries in Europe have fully fixed their electricity price system. So Norway, for instance, was energy exporter, but the price of electricity went up 8-9-fold. So they had, their ordinary citizens suffered a lot, even if the energy producers, which were in large part owned by the government, got a lot more revenue. So it could put a lot of stress on society. Again, it could be corrected if you had a different electricity price system, and there's been some countries that have fixed the problem, but many have not.
Now, we know that the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine have significant impact on economies around the world. Can you explain to us how exactly those two events reshape the global economy? What are the fundamentals of the post-COVID and the post-war in Ukraine global economy?
There have been a number of interesting changes. In many parts of the world, there is what is viewed as the end of the neoliberal globalization. In the pandemic, the rules of international trade were broken by the United States and Europe. The each of the countries hoarded their pandemic products. They wanted to protect their citizens. Mm-hmm. That was number one. And that the international trade rules were violated, well, that's okay.
Yeah.
On the other hand, the international trade rules, particularly the intellectual property rules, which resulted in a vaccine apartheid. So while the advanced countries had more vaccines than they needed, mm-hmm. There was a shortage, a terrible shortage, in the developing world, and yet the intellectual property rules said they could not produce them, even if they had the capacity to do it. It was terrible. And that has generated a lot of anger about the international trade rules. They were violated by the advanced countries, but enforced on the developing countries. So we're moving into a new era. Mm-hmm. Then comes what the United States did in the context of what we call the Inflation Reduction Act. It was really an energy bill, which again violated international rules in subsidizing, for a good purpose, but subsidizing American industry to the tune, originally thought of about $270 billion, now revised numbers over $1 trillion. That's really tilted the international playing field, and the United States has explicitly said, we're not going to obey the rules if they're inconvenient for us.
Yeah.
And so the international trade regime has been torn up. Mm-hmm. And so the ideology has changed and the practice has changed. So we're in a new world in globalization.
And what is the role of the state in this new world you just described?
Well, the role of the state became much more apparent in the context of COVID-19, because we were all saved by the actions of the state. If it hadn't been for huge investments by the government, we would not have the vaccines. Mm-hmm. And if we didn't have the vaccines,
maybe we wouldn't have this conversation right now.
Exactly. So we all recognized that we had to turn to collective action, to the state, to save us. And it really showed that the right-wing ideology, leave it to the market, doesn't make any sense. You can't leave it to the market. And now we're facing another existential issue, climate change. The market is the one that's destroying the world. We can't leave it to the market. If we left it to the market, we'd all be, what I say, frying.
Right.
You experienced the extremes of weather last summer, floods and then heat, fires. I mean, it's just terrible. We experienced it.
We'll get into the climate change discussion in a minute. I just wanted to clarify a few things about this new example, this new global paradigm shift. Who makes the rules and what is the dominant discourse here?
Well, we're in a very difficult world. The United States, Europe say we need to have a rules-based system.
Right.
We can't live in a law of the jungle. But if you look at what's happening, we're sort of in the rule of the jungle. Not quite. Let me give you an example. For any rules-based system to work, you need referees, judges, to see if somebody violated. You make an assessment. Of course they're going to say, I haven't violated. But you have to have a fair assessment and then some punishment. Well, the United States has refused to allow judges to be appointed to the WTO appellate body. So we have no judges. So the whole framework has fallen apart. The United States is violating the rules and then says we're not going to allow their judges to be appointed to assess whether and no punishment. So that's part of the story. But on the other hand, it's not quite what we would say is the Wild West. Mm-hmm. We're trying to keep the violations to a reasonable level.
Okay.
It's sort of norms, not law.
Mm-hmm.
But what many countries would say, particularly in the developing world, really what you've done is you create the rules in the North which you violate, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. but you make us obey them. Mm-hmm. So we're in a very difficult time where there's a lot of resentment going on in the third world. And the consequences of that are that we are having much less cooperation on issues like climate change that we really need.
Before we get to climate change, the resentment exists not only in the third world, but also in the interior of the Western societies. You see that also in the US with huge inequality. You see that in Europe in various countries. And we definitely need to tackle those issues. Don't you agree?
Yes, very much so. Mm-hmm. Now, much of the resentment within our countries mm-hmm. is a little bit based on a different set of factors.
Absolutely.
The
mm-hmm.
third world is very concerned about not only the inequities and inequalities, but also the fact that there are two sets of rules, you might say. Mm-hmm. One for the advanced countries and one for the developing countries. Mm-hmm. Within our societies and the advanced countries, the problem is the huge inequalities. Mm-hmm. A little bit about two different sets of rules. The rich pay a smaller percentage of their income in taxes mm-hmm. than people who are not so rich. Mm-hmm. The multinational corporations have taken advantage of globalization to avoid paying taxes. Yeah. And that of course, also gives rise to a lot of resentment and gives rise to a lot of inequality.
Right, okay. Before we get into that, let's span the discussion to the climate change. Another factor for economic instability?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. In what ways?
Well, go back to 2008 and the global financial crisis. Mm-hmm. That was related to the fact that within the American financial sector, we had mispriced mortgages, mm-hmm. Particularly subprime mortgages. Well, in my judgment, we have mispriced a much larger set of assets because we haven't fully taken into account the implications of climate change. We've mispriced assets related to fossil fuels. We've mispriced many of the real estate assets because a lot of beachfront property is going to be underwater. There other places are...
Where, in Florida?
In Florida.
Yeah.
We jokingly say that southern Manhattan will be underwater. Not right away, but including Wall Street. And, some people joke about that being the only good part of climate change, but they'll make us pay for them to move to New Jersey.
Right.
So even that is not going to be so good.
Is that something that we will see maybe in the next 2 decades or something?
Well, it depends how fast things... We've been constantly surprised how fast things have evolved. I was on the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, way back in the early 90s, the first time they had an economic assessment. We saw it coming. But the big mistake we made was we didn't see how fast it was going to come, and mm-hmm. we didn't see how bad it would be in terms of the extreme events mm-hmm. that we've been experiencing. Mm-hmm. So it's clearly coming. That's why I think at some point, and I can't tell you when, there will be a repricing of assets, and if it happens slowly, we'll manage it, but if one day, as sometimes the market does, wakes up and says, climate change is real, and we haven't thought about how it changes the value of our assets. Mm-hmm. So, to me it is amazing that the oil companies are investing in developing new oil fields. We're talking about assets that are 40, 50-year assets. Europe is committed to be carbon neutral in 27 years.
Okay.
That means these oil assets aren't going to be worth a lot. We call them stranded assets. So
yeah, the question here is whether Europe will be carbon neutral by 2050.
I'm optimistic that it will be.
Okay.
And the reason is you're going to continue to have these extreme hot summers, these extreme events, and it will be staring at you as it will be staring at the United States in the face. And young people feel it very strongly. They know it's their future. They've really taken it on board. And you know, these people, the young people, are an increasingly large fraction of the electorate.
True, true. And you're raising a very interesting point here, because I sense that the younger generation in some ways will define the electoral results in the coming decades, and I assume that the climate change issue and the climate positions will be dominant in the public discourse before elections, right?
I think so. When I talk to my students, and and those are in their 20s and even 30s.
30s, yes.
It's so much on their mind because it's going to be probably the defining issue of their lives if we don't address it.
Yeah.
And you see in their lives, they are beginning to address it, but they resent the fact that we as a society aren't. If I have my students over, we always serve vegetarian.
Yeah.
Because a very large fraction of our students have given up meat because...
Yeah, interesting. Do you sense that climate change issues will be discussed during the US presidential election next year?
The United States is in a strange place right now.
It is.
Yeah.
All of us who follow American politics are in a point where we cannot really understand what's happening, to be honest.
We can't understand it either. That there is this person and his party. That
you're referring to this person because you don't want to name his name?
Well, you Trump and the Republican Party.
Okay,
that have really lost touch with the reality and are undermining our democracy. You know, it was one thing for Trump to say the election was stolen.
Yeah.
But for a whole party to say that really undermines democracy. If you don't have an electorate that is willing to say, when you lose the election, you know, I lost. You remember what happened in the year 2000? With
Al Gore and George Bush.
Al Gore and George Bush. That was really a question of a dispute. And it was the Supreme Court intervened.
Yeah.
And yet Al Gore acted in a way that reflected his judgment about what was necessary to keep the country together.
Right.
Many of us criticized him because we said, you know, you won. And his view was more important to maintain the stability of the...
Imagine if Donald Trump was in the place of Al Gore at that point.
Exactly.
Yeah. And he would have a base to actually, he would have an argument. Somehow, you know.
But he lost by 7 million votes. Trump lost by 7 million votes. And yet he claims he won. So, and every, 50 courts have reviewed the evidence, and he lost in all of them. So, and yet the party, his party, has not, has supported him. So, so we're in a very strange place. But to come back to climate change, a very large fraction of the party denies climate change.
The Republican Party.
The Republican Party. And again, where are you? They're denying science. Do you know, in some parts of the United States, you cannot teach climate change.
What part?
In the South, some parts of the South, you cannot teach climate change because
is it forbidden by state law? I mean, how does it work?
They rip out the section of the textbooks that talk about climate change.
Wow!
Because they think that's fake science. You know, those of us who are committed to science just can't understand this. You know, we had a famous court case a century ago about whether evolution existed. And whether you could teach evolution. And we thought we've grown up. Since then, and you can teach science, and science may be uncomfortable, but we've had something called the science since the Enlightenment.
Right.
And yet, the U.S., one of the parties, Republican Party, is going back on the Enlightenment.
Just to close this whole discussion about the U.S. elections, what will be the defining issues in 2024 other than climate change in the U.S.?
Well, I think, you know, it will be personality, including whether Biden is too old. He's done a fantastic job as president, passed landmark legislation. The American Rescue Plan was very important in getting us recovered from the pandemic, the infrastructure bill, industrial policy with CHIPS Act, and then environment with the Inflation Reduction Act, attacking healthcare costs. I mean, it is the most successful presidency in many ways that we've had in a very long time. And yet, you know,
and yet people think that he's too old to govern.
And there's always a health risk.
True.
As those of us who reach that age know. But in terms of what he's done, it is very, very impressive. So there's absolutely no question. You know, on the other hand, I think whatever the age that Trump is, he's unsuited to be president of the United States.
True.
You know, just rife with lies, corruption, undermining democratic principles.
And in case he gets elected in 2024, he gets re-elected, Trump, what will be the consequences for the world economy and even the fight against climate change?
Well, the first consequence is it will put at risk American democracy. No doubt about that. You know, some people say, don't worry about it. In 30 or 40 years, maybe you'll recover your democracy. That's a long time.
That's not a lot. It's a lifespan.
It will be a disaster for the global economy. You remember in 2000, during his presidency, he just broke international rules at will. He doesn't believe in the rule of law within the country, and so he breaks international rule of law everywhere. So it will create a more fractious world, and he likes to cozy up to dictators, and that's not good for global democracy. So in every way, I think it's going to be a disaster. Now, what will be very clear for Europe is that you won't be able to rely on America as a source of defense. And Europe will have to have a European defense force. I think just no way about it. Russia sits at your border. You know, the big bear wants to swallow you. And so if you can't rely on American defense forces, you know, I've always been critical of spending money on defense, but
this time it's different.
This time is different.
Going back to the discussion a little bit on the economy, ECB raised interest rates to the highest level since the euro launch, and the US Central Bank has raised interest rates to the highest level in 22 years. Is that a smart move, or because it really affects households, business, banks, state economies?
It was a good thing to correct the abnormally low interest rates, 0. That's not a good cost of capital. That leads to all kinds of distortions in the economy.
Right.
So normalizing the interest rates was a good thing.
Okay.
But the Fed has gone well beyond that. And that is dangerous. Let me tell you why. It's dangerous in at least 2 or 3 ways. First, they misdiagnosed the source of inflation. They thought it was excess aggregate demand. If you look at where the inflation was coming from, it wasn't excess aggregate total demand. It was pandemic-related supply-side interruptions and some of the pandemic-related shifts in demand that were too large for supply responses. So let me give you an example. One, at the beginning in the United States, a big source of inflation was auto prices. We knew how to produce cars. We had the factories. They forgot to order chips.
True.
But for the chips, we couldn't make cars.
Yeah. Because the chips were produced in Southeast Asia, right?
That's right. So.
And then you had all the problems with the supply chain and the borders closed because of the pandemic, and you couldn't produce cars.
Exactly. And then eventually, we fixed the supply chain problems. We got the chips, and the price of cars come down.
Yeah.
And then the same thing about oil. The price of oil went way up.
Yeah.
We were talking earlier about how Europe and America figured out how to adjust to this energy crisis, and the price came way down.
Yeah.
So we had disinflationary forces. Price of housing went way up.
Yeah.
At the aggregate, that shouldn't have happened because we killed it off in the United States because of Trump, more than a million Americans. The total demand of housing should have gone down. You kill a million people die, demand for housing goes down. But they decided during COVID to move to nice places rather than the cities.
Yeah.
So the price of housing, there was an asymmetry. The prices went up in one place and they didn't go down in the other.
Yeah. You would expect prices in Manhattan to go down, but it didn't.
They didn't go down. And that was an example.
Yeah.
My building, a third of the apartments were empty.
Wow.
But the prices didn't go down very much.
Yeah.
So the point is that
because people decided to leave Manhattan and go outside in, say, other places like New Jersey or Brooklyn or whatever.
Hudson Valley,
Hudson
Southampton,
Valley,
but so the point is that we are now finally correcting those distortions related to COVID-19.
Yeah.
Prices are not going to go down, but the rate of change of prices, which is what inflation is, has come down dramatically, lower than 3%. And so I think we have it under control. There's no risk of explosive prices. So it was wrong for the Fed to raise the interest rate so much. And because there are long and variable lags, the dampening effect will be felt in the future. Now, the United States is lucky because we have this enormous fiscal support from the IRA that I referred to earlier. Europe, though, doesn't have the corresponding expansionary fiscal policy, and you're already seeing slow growth, negative growth, that is recession, in parts of Europe. So monetary policy has been, I think, gone too far and is now risky for the economy. it also means that you are generating unnecessary risks for the financial sector and, most importantly, for developing countries. I was just in Marrakesh at the World Bank IMF meetings, and a lot of the discussion there is that a very large number of countries are at a precipice. During the zero interest rate period, a low interest rate period, they took on large amounts of debt. It's not hard to service debt when you don't have to pay much interest, but with the interest rate going up,
it's a problem, it's a huge problem, and we see that with the problems Italy is facing now, and the problems other European countries are facing.
Exactly, and you can imagine emerging markets who don't have the resilience that European countries have. It's a real problem.
Now, let's shift the discussion a little bit to inequality. In July, you signed together with other economists and politicians a letter to the UN and the World Bank that was calling for action on global inequality. A quote from the letter: "We're living through a time of extraordinary high economic inequality. Extreme poverty and extreme wealth have risen sharply and simultaneously for the first time in 25 years. Between 2019 and 2020, global inequality grew more rapidly than at any time since World War II." So why is this happening? Why we have such a sharp inequality in our society?
I think it's partly related to the market power that grew especially strong during COVID-19. We can look at what we call markups, the ratio of prices to cost. It's a measure of market power. In a very competitive economy, prices are very close to cost, profits are very low. What we saw in COVID-19, it went way up. We understand some of the reasons for that. We were talking before about supply chain interruptions. That meant that the force of competition was reduced because if you raised your price, nobody could come in and compete with you because they couldn't get the supplies they needed. So market power increased enormously. You saw the oil companies making off like bandits. Prices of food went up. Amazon made huge amounts of money.
In this country, we tax the oil companies, though. I mean, we imposed
you
a
were
lot
exception.
of tax.
You were the exception. I argued very strongly for a windfall profits tax, but most countries didn't, or those who did only taxed a few examples of that, like in oil. So that was those huge disturbances created huge profits, and it hurt ordinary citizens. So their real incomes went down, and a few people did very well. So I think that was at least one of the forces creating this unprecedented inequality.
But the sense of inequality is also affecting so many different sectors in the economy, and I'd like to pick a little bit on education. 30 or 40 years ago, the only way for social mobility was education, right? And children from medium classes would have the chance to go and have an Ivy League education in their life, right? I am wondering how easy it is now for the average person to send their kids to college, to send them for an Ivy League education if they deserve it. Meaning, this is creating such a huge gap in the society that I cannot foresee any way to somehow tackle this problem. And you are a member of the academic elite in the United States. You teach at one of the best universities in the world, Columbia University. How do you tackle issues like this?
Well, at Columbia and Harvard and the other Ivy League, we have what is called needs-blind admissions. We accept the students without looking at what they need. We then ask them to fill out a form telling us what their parents can afford.
Right.
And we make up for the difference because we have such a large endowment,
yes.
that we can do that. The problem is that even at Columbia and Harvard and these other, the students who can compete are mostly from the top half.
Absolutely.
And the reason for that is that have a more economically segregated society. And the very rich...
They have better skills. The rich kids,
they
go to better schools.
They go to better high school.
And they also develop a lot of soft skills that are necessary to get enrollment in this kind of universities.
Exactly. So we are creating a meritocracy, and when we first thought about meritocracy, that sounds great. You know, you own the people who have the greatest merit, get to the highest positions. But we now realize that meritocracy is the way for the elite, the new way for the elite, to maintain their power. Because only their children get the skills necessary to
compete in the new world.
To be in the meritocracy. And so this is a major social problem. You know, it goes to the undermining of our public education system, which is the way we used to have the leveling, and economic integration, which meant that people of different income categories live together. And what we've gotten is more economic segregation and no equalizing of education opportunities as a result. So this is, you know, really very disturbing. It's worse in the United States than in countries where you have a national education system where at least the level of spending is equalized. But even in countries where there are national education systems, you find the same increase in economic segregation, which means that if you live in the right neighborhoods, your interactions are with other of your class, parents who are well educated, and you get this unequal, this disequilibrating force at play.
Right.
So this is a really hard problem to correct.
The rising tensions between China and the United States for the world economy, is that something they're concerned?
Yes, very much so. You know, after World War II, we thought we were moving towards a borderless world, and now borders matter. After the end of the Cold War, people like Francis Fukuyama talked about the end of history. We would all be converging to liberal democracies and market economies. We know now that that was a fantasy. And what we're seeing, particularly with this aggressive attitude in the United States, a split between U.S. and China. Not that China has yet done anything to directly affect the United States. I mean, but it has announced that it will take over Taiwan. It has already undermined democracy in Hong Kong. And it's clear that there are these strong tensions. We're trying we believe in the United States that we can have this double relationship where we compete in many areas very aggressively, but we cooperate in other areas, like in climate change.
Yeah.
That's a hypothesis that's yet to be tested. I hope we can cooperate in more and more areas, but we're in a new world here.
Now, let's shift a little bit the discussion in Europe before closing. In your 2016 book, The Euro, How a Common Currency Threatens the Future of Europe, you call the economic and monetary union of the European Union a system almost designed to fail. 7 years later, do you still have the same view, or have you seen any signs of that failure?
Well, during COVID-19, there was enormous unity within Europe, and the response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, again, enormous unity within Europe. One of the things that I advocated in that book was the issuance of Eurobonds, a mutualization of debt. In response,
and you have saw that also during the Greek crisis, right? It was one of the.
And that's what I said. They ought to do that.
Well, the first thing you said,
there was resistance then, and during COVID-19, we saw that happen.
Reality changes a lot, I guess.
Reality changed when everybody was threatened, rather than just Greece threatened. I hope that will be the model going forward. That's an example. What I said is that the economics had outpaced the politics. And we saw in COVID-19, in a sense, that politics caught up. But there are a lot of forces and a lot of discussion in Europe whether to end that Eurobond. And when they adopted the Eurobond, they didn't address a core issue, which is how do you raise the money to pay back the Eurobond? There should be European-wide wealth taxes, corporate income taxes, carbon taxes. There should be frameworks for Europe as a whole to raise money. That's important. For instance, we were talking about environmental change, climate change, and industrial policies to help move Europe to green for the ecological transition. The problem is that it's left to the individual countries, and Germany has more financial capacity than, say, Greece. If you're going to have industrial policies to attack climate change, it should be done at the European level. But you don't have the revenue sources. So they should have, back then in the COVID-19, started to develop European-wide revenue sources. They haven't, and there's actually a pulling back from the unity that you had back in 2020 and 2021.
Right. I mean, I guess Europe is a process on the going so far, and I guess all those multiple crises happening are somehow, creating new institutions and new structures all the way. Finally, you came to Greece, invited by the economics department of the National University of Athens. You will be giving a speech tomorrow on green industrial policy. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? And how important is it for governments to develop such policies?
As we were talking about a little bit earlier, I believe climate change is a defining issue of the day. I mean, if we don't solve it, it's going to be a very serious problem. Markets on their own are not adequate for addressing it. They need a little bit of a push. We need regulations, incentives, but part of the push is public encouragement, public investment, and it's changing technology and encouraging greener investment. And that was what the IRA in the United States was designed to do, move us from the internal combustion engine car into the electric car, and doing that across sector after sector. That needs a government push. And one of the themes I'm trying to develop is that the action by the U.S. has really unleveled the playing field. And what Europe needs to do is to take corresponding actions so that we address climate change and level the playing field. But then if Europe and the United States do it, what do we do for the developing countries? Because then it's unlevel versus between the advanced countries and the developing countries. And the idea that I want to push forward is a green technology fund. It's our obligation to help the developing countries and emerging markets, no matter what Europe and the United States do to contain their emissions. You know, even if we're successful in net neutrality by 2050, it won't solve the problem unless we get the developing countries and emerging markets on board.
Right.
And that's really the theme of my talk.
Professor Stiglitz, thank you very much for being with us today. It was a pleasure and an honor.
Thank you very much.